he didn't argue. He didn't try to present a defense. He didn't do anything to save his position. He recognized instantly, this is done. These depend on whether or not we think that Jesus is presenting the manager as a hero or a villain. Jews were strictly prohibited from charging interest. The parable is addressed to the religious leaders. That's who he's talking to, and I think change is very, very right.
Welcome to the Impact Nations podcast with Steve Stewart. My name is Tim. I am your host, and this is Season 9, Episode 11, Coming Up Out of the Desert. Well, last week, folks, we promised you a parable. I mean, we promise you a parable every week, but we promised you a specific parable.
Yes.
And we said it out loud, so we had to commit.
Had to commit.
And so we're here, and we're going to talk about the parable of the dishonest manager.
Yes. Or the unjust steward, or the shrewd manager. They can't even agree on the title, let alone what it means.
Nobody can agree on anything on this thing, can they?
No.
You had your work cut out for you.
Yes. Yes, I did.
Will there be any conclusion today?
Yes.
We will conclude the podcast.
We will conclude it, and I'll lay out some more possibilities.
All right. Okay.
You
so
know?
a smorgasbord of options, if you will.
Absolutely. One size fits all here.
Perfect.
Guaranteed.
I'm excited. This is going to be great.
So since you're excited, you read the parable.
I'll read the parable because it gives me something to do. Otherwise, I just sit here drinking tea. We're going to read this out of Luke 16. Now, actually, you said, and you're going to make this point in a minute, I suspect, but like you said, they don't even agree on where the parable ends. No. You've chosen to end it at verse 9, it looks like here.
At this point?
At this point, for now. Okay. So I'm going to read Luke 16. This is verses 1 through 9. He also said to his disciples, "There was a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, or you can no longer be steward.' Then the steward said within himself, 'What shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I have resolved what to do. Then that when I am put out of my stewardship, they may receive me into their houses.' So he called every one of his master's debtors to him and said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, 'Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, 'And how much do you owe?' So he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, 'Take your bill and write down 80. So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. And so I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home.'" Well, that's clear.
Thank you. We'll go now.
We're done. You're welcome, folks.
Yeah.
I've never said the word steward that many times.
No.
It's hard given our surname.
It comes a little close. It's a little too close. Unjust steward. I don't know. Okay. I found no exception, and I did a lot of reading for this week. Everybody agrees this is the most perplexing, the most difficult parable of Jesus. And as I said, they can't even agree where the thing ends.
Yeah.
There are some say it clearly ends at 8A, and that's very impressive when you look at their arguments, until the ones that clearly say it ends at 8B. And you say, oh, that's a good point. And then the ones that say, no, it ends at verse 9. That's the critical verse. Yes, I got it now. And then you've got the ones who say, no, it ends at 13 because 10 to 13 set up the juxtaposition. So there we go. And what's the moral of the story? Tim, will you tell us, please?
I will not. I'm not committing to anything on this podcast.
Is the manager a good guy or a bad guy? Was Jesus being ironic when he held him up as a model, or being truthful? I've encountered encountered 17 various interpretations.
This could be a long podcast.
It really is. We're going to look at each one of them in depth.
Perfect.
Now, we're going to look at some of them very briefly to
Okay.
try to unravel this. But as always, and this has really developed, hasn't it, over the last few episodes, we're going to look at context.
Yeah, huge. That was a big point last week.
Yeah. Now, what did Jesus, this is Luke 16, chapter 1. What was Luke 15 all about? 3 famous parables.
Absolutely.
Lost sheep, lost coin, lost son.
Lost son, yeah.
Right. So those parables were about seeking and not giving up, and also about joy, because when they found the sheep, the coin, and the father had the son returned to him, there
Huge
was
celebration
and joy. So the context is unconditional acceptance and forgiveness when the son repents,
Yeah.
and just flat out, this is all great. We found what we were looking for.
Yeah.
That's the context. So now another interesting little link, why I think particularly with the prodigal son. The manager was brought to the master for wasting his goods. That is a Greek word that only appears one other time. It's the prodigal son when he wasted his possessions.
Oh,
Yeah, only time.
just like that, just back to back.
There's other words
Yeah.
he could have used. He used the same word back to back. Probably a big coincidence, right?
Right, yeah.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
We're getting it, Luke. We get it.
Okay. This context may give us a clue to the parable's meaning. Or Jesus could have told it. You're going to get a lot of or today.
I think we have a podcast title, just or.
Jesus could have told it to shock his listeners. In other words, he set them up with the 3 nice stories and then bam, right? Because of its sharp contrast to what's gone before, he's trying to grab our attention and get us out of our complacency.
Which, of course, we've talked before. I don't know if we've talked about it much in this series, but we have talked in the past about the genre of rhetoric.
Yes.
Jesus and other rabbis and teachers of his day were heavily practiced in rhetoric, where they would, and not rhetoric like here you in our context, sometimes you say, oh, politicians engage in empty rhetoric or something like that. No, but this was actually like they had learned how to make a point by appealing to people's emotional state, things like that, and then a whammo hit them just like this. So this would be a classic example
It could be, unless
so close.
unless. But I think there's something there. Yeah. Okay. Then he says, "Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward." Not or you can no longer be steward if you don't give a good account. It's
done.
You're done, Jack. You're fired.
This is the exit interview.
Quote a famous television person from a while ago. So 2 things stand out. A, many see this pointing to an eschatological interpretation. There will come a time when everyone will have to give an account for how they've spent their lives. And instantly, the second thing, and I'm going to talk more about this later, but in a moment, his life has changed. Not maybe, not watch it or it's
done.
Game, set, match. It's changed. And so it's suddenly dead. The third point, then the steward said within himself, "What shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig. I am ashamed to beg. I've resolved what to do then, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses." Wonder what's going on there. But notice he didn't argue. He didn't try to present a defense. He didn't do anything to save his position. He recognized instantly, this is done.
Yeah.
And I think it's really, really interesting. He recognized right away how serious his situation was, and he recognized, and this is hard for us, there's no going back, right? We always want somehow, well, if this doesn't work out, I'll go back. There is no going back. And then he says, I have resolved what to do. That's like a strong decision. It's intentional, it's deliberate, and it's in response to his new situation. There's no waffling here.
Yeah.
And I think there's something in that too. Then number 5, so he called every one of his master's debtors to him and said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, "Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, "And how much do you owe?" Then he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said, "Take your bill and write down 80.
That second guy got ripped off. The first guy got a better deal.
No,
No?
we're going to show you why.
Oh, all right.
See, you're out ahead again.
I'm just doing simple math.
I can't take you to any podcast. Some really important background information. Jews were strictly prohibitive from charging interest. Couldn't do it.
Yep.
So what did they do? They would build the interest into their upfront asking price. Right? They
were going to get theirs anyway.
The ticket.
Yeah. Okay.
At the front. Now, here's what's interesting. The 100 measures, actually, baths, BATHS, is a measurement of olive oil, and it was worth about 3 years' wages. Now, in the olive oil industry, in trading, there was a bit of a danger, a bit of a threat to the process because olive oil could go bad. And if it goes bad, it's useless.
Yeah.
And so if I'm selling you oil and I'm arranging to to bring it by ship, sail from Greece, if there's a storm, if there's a delay, if there's a heat wave, so there's more risk.
Yeah.
Okay. And so as a result, it was commonplace to mark the actual price of the oil up by 100% to cover the risk. And then he goes to the next guy, 100 measures, that's cores, Kors. It's a great little Scrabble word, by the way, but never mind. Of wheat. And this surprised me. I always thought of like oil, whoa, and wheat, yeah, okay, it's a Cadillac and a Chevy. I had it backwards. 100 cores of wheat was worth about 7.5 years of wages. Ooh. So the oil was worth 3 years, the wheat 7.5 years. The cost of wheat had a less risk penalty, because it was much less likely to spoil. It could happen, but it didn't happen as easily. So the markup on wheat was normally about 20%. This is normal practice.
Yeah. So he's giving them wholesale prices?
He's kind of giving them the honest, this is what it really cost my boss.
Yeah.
In each case, the manager was reducing the same amount. It was about 500 denarii, 500 days of wages in both cases. So all the commentators agree that what the I've got Unjust Steward in my head, the manager, the dishonest manager. I'm trying to stay away from Stewart. I already explained why. What he was doing was not dishonest. He was eliminating the hidden interest that everybody knew was there. Okay? So, verse 8.
Would you say that he's, in one sense, by doing so, is actually making it a more honest transaction? Like he's trying to knock any of the... Even if it's nudge, nudge, wink, wink, like we all know this is happening, but he's actually trying to bring it back to this is what is righteous.
Yeah, this is the real
just.
cost. Yeah, it could be. Hadn't thought that, but that's very possible because there's so many things that are possible. Verse 8. So the master commended the dishonest manager because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. So here is the twist. We said often with the parables, there's a twist, a gotcha. And it would have shocked his listeners probably. It is the twist that is both the crux of the story, and it's this twist, verse 8, that is behind all the various attempts to try to explain it. As I said, so far, 17 interpretations, right?
Indeed.
So let's look at those interpretations. These depend on whether or not we think that Jesus is presenting the manager as a hero or a villain. Because
And your research was split, like,
oh yeah,
yeah.
oh
Okay.
yeah. This largely depends on where we see the parable ending. So the first view, the traditional view, the most common of all, is that the manager is wise with finances, and he is an effective user of resources, of the master's resources, but he's being commended for that, not his dishonesty. The steward is not praised for dishonest conduct, but provides an example of wisdom and diligence. The sons of this world often seem to show more resolve and smarts than in tending to their worldly problems than the Christians do in tending to their spiritual problems. That there isn't a lot of argument. I mean, that isn't very crazy. That to me is a right down the middle interpretation.
Yeah. Well, can we, like, just application wise or brass tacks? Like, what? I don't know. Do you agree with that, or are those who are not Christ followers? Are they?
Are they a little more shrewd?
A little more crafty than?
Yep.
Yeah.
Not always, but then again, I know some dishonest Christian businessmen.
Indeed.
But I also know, for example, that scam artists they go after Christian networks because they know they're going to be able to fool a higher percentage of them.
Just because there's an overall
Look
higher
at how
level of
often a
trust or
Ponzi scheme
naivete.
is brought in a whole group of people from a church or a movement or a whatever.
Yeah.
So I think there's some truth to that.
Okay.
That's in broad brush, of course.
Sure.
Second interpretation. The steward is praised in reducing the debts that so far the master has seen no return on. These are just bad debts sitting there. So he did something and he made the master look good because he reduced it. Now, the master's kind. The master gets a better community reputation. Okay? That's another interpretation. Because the manager was praised, Jesus is telling us that we need to be wise in using our resources for God's purposes. And this comes up in all kinds of different commentaries. And it is essential for effective giving, effective altruism. And of course, we would agree with that in terms of if you want to help the helpless, feed the hungry, impact nations, we have a great track record of not wasting money.
Yeah.
And that's why, we get all these various certifications and emblems. So I think that's another meaning. Okay. The fourth, the parable is an eschatological, remember that means end times, warning to entrust everything to God's mercy. Just as the dishonest manager recognizes the terrible situation he's suddenly in, and therefore moves with great urgency to make things right, to make adjustments.
In the story, he would have to move pretty quick before word gets around. You don't even work for him anymore. Like, you can't negotiate on his behalf.
He went right from getting called up on the carpet to getting out there. So just as he set things right, the eschatological interpretation is likewise Christians are called to acknowledge their sinful state and reject all complacency. Don't move slowly, move quickly. These are all fairly major different interpretations because that's why I didn't give you.
Yeah, and it seems to me that some of these can coexist. Like
Absolutely.
They're leaning in on different portions of the story.
You betcha.
So, yeah.
He reacts to his plight in a manner that Christians should learn from. Right? So that's another big one.
I'm reminded of your little interpretation that I've always loved and I use often, also from Luke's writing, from the beginning of Acts, where as Christ ascends and the disciples are sitting there staring up into the heavens or whatever, and the angels show up and say, "What are you doing staring up there? Like, there's
Get
work to be
going.
done.
There's
basically.
work to be done.
Let's go. Come on, hustle. Let's
Yeah.
get on with it."
Yeah. And the stakes are cosmic.
Yeah.
The fifth one is that related to this, Jesus, what he's praising is the manager is truthful. It's like he's come to his senses, which is that wonderful phrase in the prodigal. The steward, the manager knows he's in a crisis, and he never tries to pretend otherwise. Interesting, right?
Yeah.
Jesus is reminding us that we too must recognize the spiritual crisis of sin in which we find ourselves. Not to make excuses, not to do anything, but just face it straight on. And then the second thing in this is the manager is honest about his weakness. I'm not strong enough to dig. He faces his weakness head on. So once again, he acknowledges the reality in front of him, just as Christians need to admit their own frailties and their total dependence on divine grace. It's very hard to admit our own frailties. Number 6, and this one surprised me, but it's because they looked very much at verse 9 through to 13. The early church fathers saw the parable as being about almsgiving. Making friends by unrighteous mammon is commonly interpreted as helping those in need. Yeah, interesting.
It seems like a stretch to me.
We're going to get there a little bit when we look verse 9 and beyond. Making friends by unrighteous wealth. Church fathers placed a heavy emphasis on helping the poor, and when they were explaining this parable, and they saw it as a strong ethical obligation for the rich. Resources must not be used for personal gratification, but to, quote, make friends. They saw in the make friends in the eternal. You are helping and blessing and making friends that we're going to carry through into eternity. And here's a couple of examples. St. Augustine, making friends by means of unrighteous mammon. Have we read that verse yet? I can't remember.
The unrighteous mammon? Yeah.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that was verse 9, yeah?
Yeah, we read verse 9. Making friends by means of unrighteous mammon, no doubt, I love when people say no doubt, refers to almsgiving without discrimination in fulfillment of Jesus' exhortation to sell your possessions and give to the poor. Chrysostom, riches are a loan from God that are to be deposited with the poor so that we might receive 100-fold reward, for they will be our friends in the eternal habitation. Isn't that an interesting quote?
I like that quote.
I think it's worth reading again.
Do it.
Riches are a loan from God. Right there, that would just be a stretch, right? A loan from God that are to be deposited with the poor so that we might receive 100-fold reward. The 7th one, because there's going to be a quiz at the end.
Perfect.
Some commentators see this story as pure irony. He's saying one thing and he means the opposite, especially in verses 8 and 9. So the master commended the unjust steward because he dealt shrewdly, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, and when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. This interpretation insists that any accommodation whatsoever to worldly values is in direct contradiction to Jesus' whole life message. The sons of this world, what he's saying ironically is the sons of this world think that their self-serving, pragmatic behavior can influence their life in the age to come. This view sees verses 10 to 13 as part of the parable, therefore in direct opposition to 8 and 9. So let's read those verses. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. Whoever is dishonest in very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth or mammon. We see here a great example of Matthew and Luke taking the same saying and putting it in an entirely different context, right?
Yeah.
Matthew's Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, and where they choose to place it in their storytelling is really, really important.
Absolutely. Tells you everything about their values, their purpose for writing
what are
their
they
gospel.
trying to get through to you? Yeah.
You bet. We got one more. This one was, I went, whoa, never thought of that. The parable is addressed to the religious leaders. That's who he's talking to. Because he knows there is a judgment coming, and they are going to need to make friends with the people that they've generally been pretty nasty to, oppressive. Because Jesus knows that destruction is coming, AD 70. And with it, they, like the master, like the manager, will suddenly be put out.
Yeah.
They won't have their role, their office, they'll have nothing.
Yeah.
So some say this is to them. So let's move to the next part.
Wait, sir, when you there's a judgment coming, and so they have to make friends with the people. The people being those like the
community.
The community
Instead of
in
being
Galilee
the way
and
they've
in
been,
Jerusalem,
where they,
lord it over others
and put burdens that they're unwilling to even lift a finger. They've got to change, because in one generation, they're gone.
Yeah.
Okay. So most of these interpretations present a moral reading. And I think here's where I'm going to go a little bit right now. I think to some degree there is a water to wine reading that can be seen. Okay. If the manager is a villain, it just seems out of context with the previous parables. If he's a villain, then why verse 8? So the master commended him because he'd acted shrewdly. If the manager is good, it opens up new possibilities. And I saw a little bit of this in the many books that I read and articles. I saw a little, but not much. I mean, he's a bad guy, right? But if he's good, let's just turn that a little bit and see what we get, okay? The first point is death and resurrection. Just like the prodigal son, the theme of death and resurrection is there. By death, I mean he was in the far country. Mm-hmm. By resurrection, I mean he came to himself. By death, I mean you're fired. By resurrection, what am I going to do now? They both lost their lives, the life that they knew. They both did.
Yeah. Effectively from their choice, right? I mean, if we're drawing these parallels between prodigal son who says, "Give me what's mine, I'm out of here," to go waste it, and the shrewd manager, we pick up in the story kind of halfway through, but presumably he's getting fired for a reason. He's done it to himself. It's not an unjust master.
I think we can presume that.
Yeah.
Although he's not one with any grace. He's not saying, if you don't fix this, you're going to be fired. He says, you're fired. You're done. So I'm not going to talk about prodigal right now. I'm going to just talk about our guy.
Yeah.
He's gone from near the top of the heap, the status heap in his community. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's the right-hand guy of the big master.
Yeah.
And in a moment, he's gone to the bottom. It is from this position that he brings life to everyone in the parable. He had to go to the bottom to bring life. In the unforgiving servant that we did last week, I think, forgiveness came from the top down, right?
Yeah.
King said, I forgive you, and then he should have forgiven the other one. It came from the place of influence and strength. But in this parable, forgiveness comes from the bottom up. Forgiveness comes from a broken man. Previously, the master was getting nothing. I just thought of something. I said I wasn't going to do prodigal. But the prodigal said, I want my inheritance now. I know what to do with it. I got it together. And then he comes back as a broken man.
Yeah.
And that's when he receives everything. Interesting. So previously, there's another way in which through his own brokenness, through his own position, he brings life to everyone. We've got the debtors, but we've also got the master, because all he had was on file these bad debts that nothing had ever come, and now he gets something. And he's happy to get some back. By his death, you understand what I'm trying to get at, a water to wine thing. By his death, he brought life. He raised others up. He dies, and he himself rises to a new life where he will be invited in acceptance and inclusion. He gives us, interesting. He had built his life on respectability, having a great position and looking good and having a favored position. Now he begins a new life that is absolutely built upon his weakness and his lack of prestige.
Yeah.
Right? I've got nothing. The debtors responded to the fallen manager. They did not respond to the respectable manager. In the story, it's in his fallenness that they said, okay, let's do something. So, because he has now got a new life started that's built on weakness and vulnerability and lack of prestige, that opens things up for us. Now, here we're making an assumption, but it opens things up for the people to say, oh, okay, I will pay back, but we'll do a new deal. In other words, it was his vulnerability that opened up their hearts and lives, their response. And of course, there's a lesson for us there. Yeah. In our interaction, that as we come in that way, good things happen.
Yeah. Okay. Not coming in with humility, not I'm going to lord it over you that I've got.
Yeah, I got this all sorted out. Now just do this.
Yeah.
Because he could have. Well, he really couldn't have, but because he was broken, but they didn't know it. You made a good point. He showed up before the master got word out. And so he could have said, here's the deal, but he didn't. He says, I'm offering you.
Yeah.
Okay? So now I'm going to go a little further. You made a great point a week or two ago that St. Augustine gave a water to wine interpretation for a parable. And at two different times in his life, he gave two entirely different interpretations. That really, the parables serve to open our hearts up to what God wants to show us now.
Yeah.
Remember you making that point?
I do, yeah. Which, just to belabor that a moment, like you and I have often said to one another and to others, like in one sense, I hope to be able to disagree with myself 5 years from now, to be able to disagree with where I'm at now, because I want growth. I want to expand my understanding of these things and discover new depth to the meaning of the scriptures.
Because otherwise, when we're on a literal or an inerrancy stream, change is highly threatening.
It's very scary.
And so we see it as wrong. Change is wrong. And I think change is very, very right. And,
Yeah. So, and sometime we'll get into what don't you change? Because of course you got to have a foundation
Yeah, you
on
do.
which to build.
And that's what the apostles, that's what they worked so much on. Yeah. And really, I think their foundation was very solid, but it wasn't as big as we think. There's a lot of stuff we've got in there. They preached Christ and him crucified. And the way they preached, now we're off on a bit of a trail here, but the way they preached was predominantly by revealing Christ in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
That's what they were doing. Much more than teaching on doctrines and concepts. I'm not saying they never touched those, but what they did by and far, the main thing was preaching Christ, and he's always been there. And from the beginning of creation, here he is. Now let's discover him, right?
Yeah. And then live in light of
that discovery. Yes. Yeah. So I said that about what you'd shared with us about St. Augustine.
Yeah.
To kind of set up this last section, and I went back and forth whether I wanted to go this way, and I thought, well, let's give an application of that.
Yeah.
The dishonest manager, he didn't decide to turn over a new leaf. He didn't decide, okay, I'm going to be humble now. Instead, he was placed in a very new circumstance that challenged him to embrace death to himself. Remember, Jesus said again and again, he who seeks to save his life loses it. He who loses his life. Or unless a kernel of wheat falls in the ground, right? John 12:24. So Jesus told us, and this is what I was thinking about even today. He told us that we were to learn from him. Learn from me, for I am meek and humble. So I want to talk, as we just looked at him as a hero, but him dying, and as he dies, good things happen to those around him. But I'd like to take the next step and connect death to humility. And if that's a legitimate step, then that's something we can learn from this story as well. As you know, I like St. Isaac the Syrian very, very much. And but I restricted myself to one short quote. Humility is the ornament of the Godhead. Isn't that lovely? The Word clothed himself in it when he became man, and by it he lived among us in the flesh, and anyone who wraps himself in it truly makes himself like him, Christ, who came down from on high and clothed his grandeur and glory in humility. That's a beautiful quote.
Yeah.
I found myself, this last book I wrote, I found myself quoting St. Isaac a number of times. I didn't think, I'm going to quote St. Isaac a lot in this one. It just, again and again, what he had to say.
There's something very poetic about his language.
Yeah. And he gets down to just the foundational rock.
Yeah.
So this parable for me took me into the death of this guy, even more so than the prodigal son. And all of what I've just said, he had to come in weakness.
Yeah, and death being in this case, of course, metaphorical.
Yeah,
in terms of his former position. He's died to his former position of authority, and status, prestige, things like that. And in a moment, it's gone. And for the rest of the parable, he's operating from, I'll say, almost his humiliated self, his humbled self.
That's good. Yeah, that's true. Here's where I was trying to decide whether to get autobiographical, but I will for a few minutes. I'll say things to you that you already know, but I had some decades of ministry success. We planted churches. They did really well. I thought of myself as a successful pastor and planter and overseeing of other churches, and that's who I was. And then, so suddenly, everything shifted. And I thought of that today when I was reading about how he said, "You're fired," Everything shifted. And lest anybody is wondering, it was no moral failure. It was no financial failure. It was a different conviction of emphasis in the gospel. But anyway, the result was this had been who I am. This had been my identity. And it was suddenly gone. And it led to 2.5 really terrible years and maybe 4 years of difficulty. And I don't want to take the time to go through all of what I did, but, I ended up pastoring a small church and so forth. But I had been really, really shaken. And it was a wilderness experience. There is no two ways about it. I go from one day my phone ringing off the hook, the next day it never rings, and on and on. So this really affected my identity. We all know the right words. I am who God made me. I'm not what I do. We all know that, but it's not really true. Because we just are so entwined in our identity.
It's impossible to operate out of that truth.
Yeah. So what God did through it was incredibly valuable, but it hurt like heck. There's nothing romantic about it. I don't get sentimental of that season. I was in a wilderness, and wildernesses are really bad places. And so what happened, like the manager, I died to what I had been. I died to who I was. The other part of it is, of course, resurrection life. And what came out of all of that season was something I couldn't have even fathomed or imagined or anything. And we ended up calling it Impact Nations.
Yeah.
And Impact Nations could never have been what it is without God's going deep, at least with me at the helm. It couldn't have been. And I needed to go through a long, long, hard desert filled with so many uncertainties and so much insecurity and all of that stuff. But he was working his life into me. He who loses his life will find it, right? So I think that, and it just was like a shift. It's 20 years ago now, but it shifted deeply how I thought of myself, how I thought of God, how I thought of ministry. And Impact Nations is in part the result of some of that. The dishonest manager didn't fight back. I said that. He didn't try to hold on to his position.
Yeah.
And he didn't try to justify himself. Wait a minute, that's not fair. He embraced it, but not without a sense of great loss and confusion, probably fear and some despair, if his desert was like mine. And so we can talk some more if you want, but I'll finish with, as you know, one of my life verses is Song of Solomon 8:5. Who is this coming up out of the desert, leaning upon her lover? That's what he wants. For me, I think that's what he wants for us. Mm-hmm. He wants to give us a heart that just leans on him and loves him in our weakness, not in our strength. And that's where we find life. And that's where, like the unjust manager, in our brokenness, we give life from the bottom up.
Yeah.
So that's what I got out of this.
That's really good. I was going to ask you, and I think you've finished exactly where I think your answer would be, but if you were preaching in a church where you're just going chapter by chapter, verse by verse through the book of Luke, And, hey, Luke 15, those sermons write themselves. That stuff's fabulous. You turn the page for next week's sermon and you hit Luke 16 and you go, oi, 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 what am I going to preach? And, a nice tight 25-minute sermon. And you've presented us with a lot of different directions you could lean into, but you've landed really on those opening verses of that sudden change, that death to self, really, and the life that can come from that. Is that where you'd likely land in terms of preaching a 25-minute sermon?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. That there's death and resurrection. There's a few commentators who even said he's a Christ figure because of that. And yes, there's parallels. There's intimations of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's where I would end up. So I hope I just took us on a little journey from moral to water to wine, and then water to wine, how that can speak to any of us, in this case, speak to me in a particular area that I may not have got to if I hadn't considered a water to wine reading.
I want to just talk a little bit more about actually the process that you've gone through the last few days preparing this episode. I was having lunch with somebody I'm discipling last week, and we're just reading through the book of Matthew together. And my question every week is basically, was there anything that surprised you, anything that really bugged you, anything that encouraged you, anything that challenged you, convicted you? And he wanted to talk about the section where Jesus is dying on the cross, and suddenly all of the dead bodies of the saints come up out of the graves. And he's like, what's up with that? I was like, I don't know. So I went, as I often do when I hit verses where I'm like, I don't really know why this is here. I went to the Orthodox Study Bible and looked to see what did some of the church fathers and stuff have to say about this passage. And they give a little bit of a water to wine meaning about, and I'd have to go back and look at it again in terms of the message that those who were raised to life and go into the city and encounter others that they bring. But what they don't answer in the Orthodox Study Bible, at least, is the basic question, what?
Yeah.
Like, hold up, Matthew, could you just give us a couple more verses about what that looked like? And of course it begs the question, I don't know, are they just bones? Are they dust? Are they fully resurrected bodies? Like, what is the deal? But the point I'm making is this. Is it okay to read passages like that? Read passages like the Shrewd Manager. Ask, Lord, what do you have for me in this moment? And then, in the end, be encouraged in some ways. You just have done in the last few minutes beautifully for us. But come away with still more questions than answers and go, I don't know why Luke, told that story where he did. I don't know ultimately what Jesus was really trying to get through. I know how this is ministered to me or changed my frame of mind, my perspective today, but I'm still at a loss on this, and there could be a bunch of interpretations, and that's okay.
And hence, the church fathers, following John and Paul, talked about the great mystery of who Christ is. Indeed. And of following him. Yeah.
You wrote a book about that.
I did.
If you haven't read Pursuing the Mystery of Christ, by the way, you should do it. It's my favorite. I said it, I don't know, earlier this year when it came out, I said it, and I meant it. It's my favorite book that you've written so far. And beautifully, you mentioned earlier this episode too, actually, about just this revelation of Christ in the Old Testament, and more than just the theophanies, those moments where clearly perhaps not so clearly in some of them, but it's Jesus, the person of Jesus in the story, but also just all of the ways that the Old Testament is pointing to the person of Jesus and the full revelation of God in the person of Jesus. So if you haven't got that yet, you can get it on Amazon, you can get it on our website. Pursuing the Mystery of Christ. It's a fabulous read. I would encourage you, grab it. It will minister to you greatly. Are you willing to tell people what you're going to talk about next week? There can't be any more challenging than that one.
No, I think I climbed the top of the hill, and now we get to glide.
Perfect.
And I got my GT snow
Does that mean
racer.
it's all downhill from here?
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, I opened that door, didn't I? Yeah, I've been working on the Good Samaritan, and we'll see if there's anything I can say that hasn't been said 1,000 times.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I bet there is. I bet there's some water to wine in there that we haven't heard before. Folks, thank you so much for being with us today. If you're watching on video, that means you're probably watching on either YouTube or our website. We host, actually, I don't know if you knew this, we work hard to make sure that you can find all of this stuff on our website. So we've been recording video of this podcast for a number of years. So there's, for several seasons, there's the YouTube videos available right on our website, plus the audio version, either one. So you can go to impactnations.com/podcast and find that, or just subscribe through YouTube, youtube.com/@impactnations. You're going to find us. There's playlists with this season 9, plus all of the seasons before it. And if you subscribe, hit that little bell, subscribe, you'll get notified when a new video comes out. I think we're every Thursday we release those, or your favorite podcast app. And do us a favor, by the way, 2 things. Do us 2 favors. I don't mind. You've been getting free teaching from us, so do us some favors.
Wow.
Help us out. Leave a review on your favorite podcast app. Leave a good 5-star review or 2 thumbs up, whatever they do. And just tell some folks what you think about this. But then secondly, share an episode with a friend. If there's been an episode this season or last that has really, really impacted you, changed the way you think on something, or even if it bugged you and you just want to disagree and rant and rave to a friend, get them to listen to it, and who knows, maybe we'll have a great conversation that way. Share it with your friends, help more people discover it. We're really enjoying sharing this time with you, and we'd love to share it with more people as well. So do that. Make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Wherever you're getting us, subscribe. And we will see you again next week with The Good Samaritan. Thanks so much. Have a great week. God bless.
Bye-bye.